Great, thanks, Daphne. Welcome back to Senate Education. It's 3:32 p.m. We are pleased to have Gwen Carmoli with us, who is going to, if you wouldn't mind, Gwen, start by taking us back to reminding us the charge that we gave you and your team for over the summer. And then we'd love to hear some recommendations and take us through the report. So with that, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. And it's a real pleasure to see this group. I really appreciate the focus that your committee has put on increasing literacy outcomes for students in the state. Thank you very much. So the charge you gave us was enormous, I have to say. There are 5 hefty tasks for us to do. And it's a real honor to be working our way through those. I'm Gwen Carmoli. I serve in this capacity as chair of the Advisory Council on Literacy. I was nominated by the group and then selected by the group, and Beth O'Brien is our vice chair. So I am representing the group that was outlined in Act 28, and I'll walk a little bit through Act 28 and then the report of our work to date. I also, just to let you know, I am director of curriculum in Colchester. So when I'm sitting here in my office in Colchester, a lot of beautiful snow outside there. And I serve as the president of the Vermont Curriculum Leaders, which is how I happen to be on the advisory council.
Great.
So Act 28 that you worked on last year, the House was working on a bill, Senate was working on a bill, and you passed Act 28. And you outlined a series of tasks for us. You outlined membership, a number of meetings that we are allowed to meet up to 8 times in a year, a series of tasks, and our charge is very, very clear. It's to advise the charge of the council is to advise the Agency of Education, the State Board of Education, the General Assembly on how to improve literacy outcomes for students in pre-kindergarten through grade 12 and how to sustain those outcomes. Well, that's a large charge. And then you gave specific tasks within that. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the report as I'm moving my way through it. And let me know if you can see, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm going to keep it in this mode just so I can move my way through it. So when I am presenting, I'm also presenting for all members of the group. And I'm just going to pull to that page. Our membership is a wide variety of expertise. Some are literacy experts, some are systems experts. We have the Secretary of Education, Dan French. We have the chair of the Vermont Standards Board, Bill Clark. We have the Vermont Superintendents Association represented with Chelsea Myers, Sandra Cameron from the Vermont School Board Association. And actually she has just swapped herself out with Martine Gulick, probably in the legislative session. She's very busy right now. The Vermont Council of Special Educators, the Executive Director, Darren McIntyre, Beth O'Brien for the Vermont Principals Association. Mill Moore has just passed Susan Gray as representative for the Vermont Independent Schools Association, Don Tinney, Vermont National Education Association. And then I am representing Vermont Curriculum Leaders. We have 3 fabulous teachers, Catherine Cameron, Jen Farnsworth, and Susan Koch. And then we have community members, Cynthia Gardner-Morse, Emily Lesh, Julia Spalding. And I think and Julia, I have to give her a big shout out. She's our student representative. And so she's attending school and providing representation for students across the state. We really appreciate her being available. And then we have a literacy specialist, a special education literacy specialist from the Vermont Agency of Education, Jackie Kelleher. So we were tasked with 5 things, 5 roles. And they're large tasks for us to do. The first task that we were asked to do was to provide updates for Section 2903 focusing on implementation and maintenance of the plan. We have future tasks, which are to provide advice on services to supervisory unions and districts on implementing the plan, to provide advice on plan for collecting literacy-related data, provide best practices in literacy instruction for tiers. This is multi-tiered systems of support. This is tiers 1, 2, and 3. And then to provide a review of literacy assessments. We kicked off our work the last day of August. We did organization in August and September, and then we jumped into our first task, which was actually the last task. Because in order for us to do our work, we needed to have baseline data. I mean, I would say this just as we do in classrooms or in any organization, you want to know the baseline information. So we started with, what are those literacy assessment outcomes that we need to know more about in order to continuously improve? The council is representative of varied roles and varied expertise with one strong commitment to increase these literacy outcomes. There is shared agreement that the outcomes that we see are not strong enough. There's overall low literacy achievement. About 50% of our students are meeting expectation, which means that about 50% of our students are not meeting expectation on the grade 3 SBAC assessment. And that's very concerning. And there are large achievement gaps. So we are looking at achievement gaps for the historically marginalized, which are students in poverty, students with disabilities, racial disaggregation groups. So we have work to do, and that's a common focus on the group. So we started with our data, and we reached out to the Agency of Education to give us an overview of the data. They focused in on our literacy assessments for our Smart and Balanced assessment and for the NAEP assessment, and they're assessing two different things. NAEP is a sampling assessment across the country, so we have a chance to see how Vermont compares to other states, but it is not every student in every grade that is assessed. Smart and Balanced is a comprehensive assessment on reading and writing, on literacy, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and it is every grade, grades 3 through grade 9. So they're assessing two different things, and it is only students in Vermont that we are looking at our comparative data when we look at our Smart and Balanced results. We definitely showed those that there was about a 24 to 30 percentage point gap for the historically marginalized, those who are not marginalized versus those who are marginalized. There's a particularly wide gap for students in poverty and students with disabilities. That showed up in Smart and Balanced and in the NAEP assessment. And we showed overall low scores, and we saw a trend line declining down. Now, it should be noted that last year's Smart and Balanced assessment was, we were still in hybrid learning and it was optional. So, well, not every student, some students had the ability to opt out. If you were a remote learner or a hybrid learner, you had the ability to opt out of the assessment. So it may not represent every student. So our most recent assessment results are a little bit of an outlier in the data that we have. So we worked on that data. We came to the conclusion that as a full group, it matched up with the charge of the work. We knew that it would, but sometimes you have to see the data there. And we agreed that we needed a little more information. So we invited the agency back to give us more information about the difference between Smart and Balanced and NAEP assessment. The agency gave a fantastic set of information on the agency website. They responded to our questions. It was well referenced, well researched. They did a terrific job. So when we followed up, we feel confident that we are representing that there is a problem. The scores are declining. They are lower than we would want them to be, and we have large achievement gaps, particularly for students with disabilities and students in poverty. I'm going to switch my screen for just a second to show you that the Advisory Council on Literacy's information is on the Vermont Agency of Education's website. There's a page for the councils, and they maintain our site and our information. It includes agendas, upcoming meetings, and any past minutes. So if you are interested in the work, we invite you to follow them. We do post agendas ahead of time. We post our minutes afterward. They are open meetings in the same way that any of your meetings are open. So we invite the public to join us. And if they're not able to join us, they could send comments ahead. So if they have something they would like to share, we are interested in the input from the field. That said, we are a council that is working toward consensus. So we absolutely are inviting input, but it is not any one person or any one perspective. We have to then take all of that input and turn that into a consensus decision that the council members agree upon. So what we represented in the report is a representation of where our final discussion on statute 2903 and on the data showed. All right, back to the report. So we worked through the data. We found common ground in there. There's lower achievement than we would like. There are larger achievement gaps. We have a literacy problem. We are committed to this work. The next task, which was task 1, was to look at statute 2903, which is a statute that sets up the statewide literacy plan. We reviewed that. We sent the council members back to constituency groups, and we asked them to review it. We wanted to know what are some strengths of the statute, what are some possible areas that you would recommend changing, and why, using specifics within the statute 2903. And our recommendations need to line up with Act 28, Act 173, Education Quality Standards, and the District Management Group report. It is very important that the work that has come before us and that sits in our statutes and is built upon, our statutes are premised upon, that our recommendations follow along that work. I'm going to take a breath and ask if there are any questions before I get into our recommendations.
Not seeing any.
Okay. The first thing I like to start with are strengths, because I think it's important. It's hard work that goes into everything that is put before our council. And the strengths of 2903 that the council found was there was agreement that the ability to read is critical to success and learning. And there was a conversation, it's not in the learning, just in the learning right now, but it's in the learning in the future as well. There was also agreement on the strength that public schools that offer instruction in grades 1, 2, or 3 shall provide highly effective research-based reading instruction to all students. There's a little bit of an amendment, I would say, that's coming up next. Actually 2 amendments. And so we agree that it is really important for those early grades to have high quality reading instruction and based on the proficiency of grade level readers. So that the other piece that we found as a strength was that supplemental reading instruction in grade 4, whose reading proficiency follows below grade 3 reading expectations, is needed. This is following along the lines of MTSS, that when a student is struggling, supplemental reading instruction is important. And it shouldn't just be in the place of reading instruction, it should be additional, that supplemental piece. Where my friendly amendments are in terms of where, if we are recommending change, the term research-based that shows up in statute 2903, in our federal requirements for our federal grants, we have a requirement for evidence-based. So we would recommend that statute 2903 change that language to reflect evidence-based. The other thing that we would ask is that it extends beyond just it says students enrolled in grade 4, supplemental reading instruction for students enrolled in grade 4 following below. We would say that this should happen in any grade. That in
Senator
kindergarten. What's that? I'm sorry.
Senator Perslick has a question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there, but on the research versus evidence, in your mind, is there a difference? Is it just semantics, or is there an actual difference?
There is a difference. So an example of that, in the federal guidelines, they have a 4-point scale of evidence-based, and there are certain types of things that meet, there's certain criteria that meets evidence-based versus research. So I may research something and say this is the best of, but the evidence part says there's an efficacy component to it, and usually means that it's experimental or quasi-experimental. And experimental, actually, it sounds like it. Those two terms sound like they are not very official, but actually it means that there's a standard international process for going through an evidence-based study. Controlled randomized study is an example of that.
Okay. And one of the reasons I ask is you or the council used research-based in their second recommendation.
Yeah, so in the second recommendation, the first recommendation was change research-based to evidence-based. And
well,
the second,
no, the second of the other, I guess of one of the findings was using research-based, but it's in quotation marks, so I thought it was a recommendation, but those three overall findings.
Those were the 3 areas we found as strength. And so we would say the strength part is that the supplemental reading instruction is the part of that. And we used current language from the existing bill. And I would agree that I didn't mean to cause any confusion there, but using the existing language, this was something the council agreed on was a strength, but we would recommend that you switch the reference of research-based to evidence-based.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Another area that we recommended change was, and this is a small technical piece, which is where the current statute of MTSS is referenced, is to update the reference number 2902. I know they're small things, but as we start working across multiple documents, that's an area that would create some alignment. An area of recommendation the council made was to include preschool and kindergarten. Act 28 references it. We have reference in the DMG report on early literacy. So to strengthen statute 2903, we would recommend adding pre-K and kindergarten into that. And then our last recommendation is about the supplemental reading. And really, this is about flexibility of any time when students, it may not just be beyond grade 3 and grade 4 and beyond. It may happen in kindergarten that a student is struggling, or it may happen first grade, second grade, or any time. So a reference, if you were going to make a change, we would recommend that that any grade on the continuum of pre-K through 12 would have supplemental reading if they're falling below grade level. Are there any other questions about statute, our recommendations for statute 2903?
I don't see any.
We've only met, at the time that we wrote the report, we had met 4 times, and 2 of them were organizational. So we were at a very large hurry to make sure we met the deadline of having the report to you, Senator Campion, and to the committee by December 15th. It was very important to us that we build a culture of agreement, and the temperature, hang on just a second. My phone rang. the temperature of the literacy conversation across the state is a high intensity conversation, and there's definitely disagreement across the country. What we're working on is what are our agreement points and how do we increase literacy outcome for our students in Vermont. And we have a fantastic group of people working on this and a deep commitment together. So we worked on Act 2903. We have started to review the blueprint, which is our statewide literacy plan, which is the next task that we are working on. And this is focused on the implementation and the maintenance of the statewide literacy plan. We are again inviting input from the constituency groups. So for example, I'm the representative for the Vermont curriculum leaders. I bring it back to the Vermont curriculum leaders. I invite input there, bring that back to the council. We narrow it. We review all of them. And then we narrow and we go through a consensus process. So that's the work that we have next ahead of us. By the end of the year, we will be finished with task 5 and task 1. Next year, when we kick off again, we will look at we will revisit task 5, any new data, and then we will begin with task 2. And let's see what our task 2 is. Task 2, task 3, next year we'll be working on the literacy data component to this.
So Ms. Carmoli, we basically, you are a permanent fixture now, this committee, correct? I mean, it's, this is ongoing work. You did not have an end date, so I do not, it's up to you to define that part of it.
You
know, you're in it for a while, I think, which is great. Yeah. No, I think this is the kind of check-in. This is the kind of reporting that I think is just going to get better and better and better. And I'm hoping the members will be able to stay there with you going forward, and that you have no plan of leaving anytime soon either. There is that, consistency makes a big difference, a huge difference.
Yes, thank you.
This kind of work.
It should be noted, I am on a 2-year membership in this one, and then I have the ability to renew that one time. So I am in it to win it.
Great.
I am really committed to this work, and I'm really committed to increasing outcomes for our students. I do that in my role here in Colchester. Yeah. I speak to that for our curriculum directors, and I'm representing that for the council. So thank you, and it's helpful to know that it's ongoing. I was a little worried about.
This is just the beginning. Questions for Ms. Carmoli at this point. I think what we'll be doing is we'll all have to dig in a little deeper. There are some recommendations that we'll have to consider, and we'll have Ledge Council draft those and help us navigate that process. Senator Chittenden.
Mrs. Carmoli, good to see you. So you spoke to a few of your recommendations. The one you started off with, Senator Pershlik already asked a question, but I wanted to probe a little bit further. So on the evidence-based terminology that you want to see, and I think it was 2904, is there a pressing time matter, and what cautions would you have for us if that doesn't get changed? What is the risk that there is to keeping it in that research base? Not that I'm advocating for it, but I'm just trying to understand and gauge how fast we might want to take this up as part of a committee miscellaneous bill or otherwise.
So an example of that is the Consolidated Federal Programs, which is an annual federal grant that flows through the state. Those applications are due July 1. We have to evidence strategies. So when I put in a strategy in the consolidated grant, I have to reference what level of evidence a strategy has. So evidence-based is something that I have to do in my annual application. Research-based, there are some high-quality things that are research-based, but what they may not demonstrate is what the level of evidence is. So it would get rejected it may get rejected in a state or federal grant. And aside from that, when you go onto the U.S. Department of Education, it says evidence-based. So John Hattie, I don't know if you're familiar with John Hattie's work, but he does a meta-analysis of instructional strategies, and it shows an evidence base for instructional strategies, and it gives a long list. And anything over a 0.4 is considered favorable and gains more than a year's worth of outcome. There are some that are negative, and so those would not be instructional strategies I would do. The What Works Clearinghouse gives us levels of evidence and looks at programs and practices. And then there's a recent report by Ed Reports, which gives us evidence of alignment to standards. So evidence-based is just really important. And the timeline for us is end of school year as we're applying for funds for next year.
Okay. So we will return to this topic. I mean, the other thing that I think we're all interested in, Ms. Carmoli, and this is more coming from the agency, is how things are going with training teachers. How are we doing getting teachers up to speed around how to most effectively teach literacy?
That's a great question. And actually, one of the questions out to the field is, where are we in implementation? So it's sort of like the baseline data that we needed for outcomes. Now we need the baseline data. Where are we on implementation? I know the agency was developing an RFP process. I know that across the state, different supervisory unions, districts, and schools are providing different professional development. But it also, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so some of the professional learning that may have been planned may not be happening right now. I'm not certain where the agency is on their RFP process for developing the literacy professional development. We're looking forward to seeing that. I know it's going to be aligned to standards and evidence-based practices. I know they've talked about the importance of science of reading and building those foundational skills. Also building comprehension for later in any grade from kindergarten on. So a balance of some pieces. So I just can't tell you when the timeline is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that though. I appreciate knowing that you're all also looking for that. And I agree, these are challenging times to say the least. But I think it's safe to also say that, you know, we don't want to get behind in this area. This would only exacerbate some of the struggles that I think children are having out there, you know, with generally, you know, with remoteness, not being in school, all those kinds of things are going to play into some of the literacy challenges going forward.
Yes, and I can speak at my district as I was reviewing our literacy data. It actually was, I was expecting a larger gap than I saw. So our outcomes were consistent with similar outcomes in the past. So that was, were fairly consistent. So I think the pandemic has impacted across the country math more than it has literacy. I think it's really important that we keep our eye on the early literacy and the struggling reader in this, and how to provide the supplemental instruction that's needed, and that on the ground instruction for every student in those early years.
So it's 4 o'clock. We're going to have to leave it there. But I'm wondering, Ms. Carmoli, before you go, if you would also be thinking, and I know you're incredibly busy as well, but we know we've heard from a colleague of ours, their grandson entered kindergarten when the pandemic started. He's now in 2nd grade, been in and out of school for a number of different reasons, whether going remote or infection in the school classroom, needing to be at home. How are we going to really be thinking about the long-term negative impacts of this in our students? We've been talking a little bit about the social emotional pieces. We're going to hear from the governor's office around some of the mental health supports. How do we think about this in terms of learning loss for not just a year out, but, you know, a decade out? And just something to, if you'd partner with us and give that some thought, we'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think as we are considering that data piece, it's really important next year when we approach the looking at the advice on the collection of literacy data. We need to look at this in a long-term manner. And so just to look at it year by year may not be enough. And we need to see what those trends are. And I understand pandemic may be an outlier, but there are trends that are following leading up to and perhaps past that. And so we will watch that, and I will bring that back to the council.
Great.
Please reach out if you need anything. We are, I'm open to input, and I really appreciate your time and your focus on literacy. This is important to students in our state.
No, we appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, any final words before we leave for the day? There's a chairs meeting, and I know that we also tomorrow we'll be picking things back up with an update, as I've mentioned several times now, on what's happening in our classrooms, as well as the governor's recommend, as well as a couple of bill walkthroughs that we'll do. Okay. Have a great evening. Thanks, everybody.